How do you feel about this bill that's being presented by Senators Boxer and Markley?
Well, the new bill introduced by Boxer today is the kind of improvement we need on the Toxic Substances Control Act. A lot of the environmental legislation we got in the 1970s was pretty good, but there were some real problems with this one. I actually testified at Senate hearings in support of the Toxic Substances Act in 1973 and 1975 at Senate hearings. And so it's been disappointing to look back on 40 years of legislation that's so seriously flawed. And so we do, it's great if we can improve upon it. But the first legislation that was proposed to do that this year was not an improvement. It was basically a sellout to the chemical industry and the oil industry. And it contained provisions that would preempt the states from doing things that the federal government hasn't done. The history of environmental legislation in this country is full of examples where the states have done all kinds of good things. And once it's demonstrated in California or New York, or New Jersey, or Massachusetts, then it can be done at a national level in Washington. This has happened time and again with lots of different environmental issues. And this law would, for the first time, prohibit the states from doing anything to regulate toxic chemicals that the federal government hasn't done. So this is the worst thing that needs to be taken out of the bill that was first introduced as the correction to the old Toxic Substances Act. Anyway, the new bill doesn't have those kinds of industry-oriented restrictions. The new bill also has deadlines, so the environmental groups can take the government to court if they're supposed to be doing something about a toxic substance and they take too long. And by not having deadlines, there's no way of taking the agency to court, and you're left waiting indefinitely for regulation on toxic chemicals. On the other hand, the industry, under the bill that was introduced by the chemical and the oil industry, would have an easy time taking the government to court if it wants to challenge any regulations that manage to get through that gauntlet. They have a low bar for challenges to the regulations, but in order to force the government to issue regulations, there's a very high bar, or rather, there's no bar at all. There's no deadline in the law. It's complicated, but basically you've got the oil industry and the chemical industry pushing one bill, and you've got the environmental groups, all but one, on the other side, trying to really fix some of the flaws in the Toxic Substances Control Act and provide for public protection from toxic chemical hazards that exist. We're not talking about extreme stuff. We're just talking about reasonable stuff that the government ought to be doing in terms of getting information about the chemicals and regulating them.
So I know that you see a lot of the human face of the results of some of these decisions. And corporations that run oil and gas or chemical companies are run by people. How do they justify in their minds, when they see the net result after, I understand day one, but year 21, when the evidence is so clear, what do they say?
That's the one thing I think I'll never understand. I spent the last 40 years reading corporate documents, dealing in the arena of regulation with industry and its representatives, and reading the corporate documents that have come up in the asbestos litigation especially has been extraordinarily educational for me. There's no altruism there. Occasionally a company doctor or a company industrial hygienist says, we ought to spend some money and clean up this place, or we ought to warn these workers about this. But it's usually couched in the language of business. They say, oh, we should do this, it'll reduce labor unrest, it'll reduce workers' compensation claims, it'll, you know, they try and sell it to the people who are making these decisions because the decisions are made by businessmen. The company docs and the industrial hygienists don't run the company. They can be replaced at the drop of a hat. And so there's no conscience in the corporate model, really, as we think of the word. It's strictly bottom line. And you see it again and again with the corporate documents. And every once in a while, somebody in the corporation says, well, we really ought to do something that we don't have to do. It would cost us a few $1,000s, but it's the right thing. And, but that's rare. You don't even usually see in the corporate documents. And these companies who are being sued in asbestos litigation, they would like to show that they did something good, that they had some sensitivity about these things once they knew about asbestos being dangerous. And they haven't produced any corporate documents that you know, show that they're doing something they didn't really have to do. They're spending money they didn't really have to spend on worker protection, on consumer protection, on environmental protection. You just don't see that. And so your question goes to the question of, oh, how is it that this world we're living in that is increasingly dominated by corporations is so ruthless? And it's a kind of ruthlessness that gets refined in the corporate model, so that if somebody who is running the company or is on the track to running the company goes out on the golf course with the big shots and says, you know, I think we ought to spend $100,000 to clean up the dust in this plant I just walked through. We know it's making these guys sick in the long run. They're not complaining. There's no OSHA inspectors going to be coming around anytime soon. In this country, we have one OSHA inspector for every 66,000 workers. So they ain't worried about OSHA coming around. And if there's no union, well, there's hardly any unions. And if the workers aren't complaining, it's easy to just not spend the money. And so this guy, he's out on the golf course with the big shots, and he says, we ought to spend the money. We ought to do the right thing. And then as soon as he's out of earshot, one of them turns to the other and says, Jimmy's not tough enough to run the company. I think that's really the way it works. It's a kind of ruthlessness that gets refined in the corporate model that is more reliably ruthless than what you might expect if you looked at individuals that make up the corporation.
So where do our universities, our young people coming up, what are they taught? Isn't that where it all goes off path? What are we teaching our young people?
Well, I'm not in the academic world, but the universities have historically been bastions of free speech, bastions of protest against the establishment, or at least they were when I was growing up. And they were in South Africa when I was there in the 1980s. But I don't know whether that's still the case today. We ran a project at Yale. Yale University had given an honorary doctorate to a multi-billionaire asbestos magnate from Switzerland. He had sold or been forced to close his asbestos enterprises all over Europe and also some in South America once asbestos became notorious. Mainly the European operations had to go, and they made a decision that they would just get out of it. Then this guy reinvents himself as a green businessman. He creates something called the World Business Council on Sustainable Development and is one of the leaders of the business contingent to the Earth Summit at Rio de Janeiro in 1992, talking about how companies need to be more sustainable in the way that they don't pollute so much, that they use energy efficiently, that sort of thing. And so Yale University, 4 years after that, gives this guy an honorary doctorate for being a great environmental leader in the business community. Well, comes, in Italy they have this quaint look at death on the job as potentially a criminal matter. And they had actually prosecuted some of Mr. Schmidt-Heine's underlings in Italy running his Italian operations in the 1980s and 90s. And so he was prosecuted in a trial that started in 2009 in Turin, Italy. And he was convicted by the trial court and sentenced to 16 years in jail. He never appeared in Italy during the trial, but he was represented by able counsel. I testified in the case. He was represented by about 10 million euros worth of lawyers a year, and that's like $13 million. And so then the case went to appeal, and Schmidt-Heine the appeal court said, yeah, by this cover-up you've done in our country, you delayed the ban on asbestos by 10 years, you caused 3,000 deaths, you created an environmental disaster, and they reaffirmed the long jail sentence. They actually raised it by 2 years to 18 years in jail. Then the case got thrown out. Well, at this point, I'll interrupt that story by saying that at that point, the people from Casale Monferrato, the community most grievously affected by this in Italy, contacted me and they said, can you do something about Yale? And so I started to approach Yale. A lawyer I work with lives in New Haven. He has a nice view of Yale University from his office window. And he started to write letters to Yale saying, I represent the community of Casale Monferrato, a town of 35,000 people where one person every week dies from mesothelioma, from the asbestos contamination this company left behind. Not all of them workers, many of them from environmental exposure. And so we went to Yale to see if they would at least reconsider whether this honorary degree should stand or whether they should rescind it. And Yale has absolutely refused. And we had unions writing, we had the Asbestos Diseases Awareness Organization in the United States, scores of scientists signing on letters asking Yale to do something about this, over 50 alumni asking Yale to at least reconsider this honorary degree. And this is one of our most respected schools in the country, the Yale University, and they wouldn't even reconsider it. They kept on responding with the same 2 or 3 lines about how we gave him the degree for his good deeds in the 1990s, and that's it. We're not going to discuss the facts. We're not going to discuss the cover-up, the evidence that came out during the criminal trial, which they couldn't have known about in 1996 when they gave him the honorary degree. So, I mean, if Yale University is any example, then I've got to be worried about what people are learning in school about corporate crime and how we need to try and do something about it.